The planet looked like all Earth-type planets, a blue-white pearl with yellow and green patches of continents. It had more water and less land than Earth, and the polar ice caps were barely visible, indicating a warmer climate, but overall, it was just another planet. The three men gathered on the bridge of the Ibis scout ship, looking at the image on the screen. "I see no sign of a colony," Montes said. His swarthy, cheekbone face, as always, conveyed every emotion he felt. At the moment, it was a disappointment. They should have spread out at least a little throughout several centuries. If they've deteriorated to the Stone Age, like those poor souls on New Tuscany, then even from close orbit, nothing will be visible, Falson said. "We need to pull up the archives and find the exact coordinates of the old base." Although Falson was formally the ship's captain and Montes and Koltsov his subordinates, the relationship between the three researchers was friendly. They had been working together for years. "No need." Koltsov pressed a few keys, enlarging the image. It centered on the dark, angular spot on the shore of a narrow, long bay on one of the continents. They may not have spread across the planet, but they had time to build a city. The ship was still too far away. Even at the highest resolution, it was still impossible to see whether the city was inhabited, but the characteristic outline of rectangular blocks separated by straight streets left no doubt that it was a city. They had found another lost colony. They only had to explore if there were still any surviving colonists there. When Tlayne came to his senses, the first thing he saw was Selna's whitened, frozen face. More people were behind his wife's back, but his vision had not yet fully recovered after the writer's session, and he saw them as if in a fog. Tlayne knew that he must let them know he had returned. He slowly raised his hands with palms up and spoke a required phrase. "You must ensure, but from what I feel, the session is over, and I have a full will." A strange expression flashed in Selna's eyes, and she swayed her whole body as if she wanted to step forward and rush toward Tlayne, but held back at the last moment. Instead, the Watchers of the Will pushed past Tlayne's wife toward him. They deftly put his hands behind his back and handcuffed him, then led him to the control house, where he was to serve the mandatory 3-day quarantine after the session. Tlayne walked quietly, not trying to ask questions or look around. He knew it wouldn't lead to anything good, especially considering the fear on the face of his wife. Everything would be told to him later at the control house, and yet he made one small mistake. He lowered his head and looked down at his feet. He thought he was standing in a puddle. Considering it was the rainy season, it was normal, but it turned out he wasn't standing in the water at all. Later, he couldn't figure out how he had managed to get to the control house without losing consciousness. He spent the entire quarantine half-conscious. Watchers came and went, trying to talk to him about something, but Tlayne barely reacted to them. Only one of them, a particularly persistent one, apparently he had been put in charge of Tlayne's recovery, kept trying. Eventually, something penetrated Tlayne's almost completely stupefied mind and set in motion the process of bringing him back to life. "Tlayne, it's not your fault. No one can be blamed for what the rider who occupied him has done. You've just been very unlucky. People will understand. They won't take revenge on you. However, I'm afraid you'll have to leave the city for a while and settle on a plantation until the memory fades." "Children," Tlayne said with difficulty, manipulating his lips and tongue as if they were lifeless foreign instruments. He wondered if this is how the riders feel when they occupy another human being. Or is it a natural process for them? "What?" the Watcher asked. "Children," Tlayne repeated. "My children. Did any of them survive?" The watcher took a deep breath and placed his hands on the table in front of him, interlacing his long, bony fingers into a weighty ball. Tlayne, what exactly do you remember? What was your last memory before the Mind Rider took over? That was the question Tlayne dreaded the most. However, he knew that watchers never ask idle questions. These people had a lot of experience with those who had just been abandoned by the Mind Rider. So Tlayne tried to overcome the desperate resistance of his own psyche. We went to the cafe, with my wife Selna and my sons. The pain became almost physical, and he raised his eyes to the watcher in desperation. Please don't. Just tell me the truth. There is no escaping it. My sons. He fell silent, unable to continue. The watcher sighed and smiled weakly. Just a little. Just at the corners of his mouth. But it was like he'd splashed Tlayne with scalding cold water. How could that damned watcher smile when the boys were... They were... by Tlayne's own hands. Protocol requires that I first ascertain the level of consciousness of the one being restored, the watcher said. But I think we can make an exception to the rules in your case. Your sons are fine, physically at least. A wave of emotion swept over Tlayne, so intense that he almost drowned in it. It was a complex mixture of gratitude, relief, confusion, and, yes, and terror. He looked at the watcher with hope and incomprehension. Are they all right? But then who? I saw the blood. Only now did he realize the watcher's strange caveat. Did you say physically? What does that mean? The smile faded from the watcher's lips. Your sons were not directly harmed by the rider's actions, yet it happened right in front of their eyes. Few adults can bear such a sight, even those who have been in your shoes. The watcher looked Tlayne straight in the eye, and his hard, barbed gaze made Tlayne uncomfortable. While in your mind, Mind Rider killed 3 people. Your family saw the whole thing, from beginning to end. I'm afraid they won't soon be able to forget it. The emptiness came over Tlayne, squeezed his throat, and his heart fell to the bottom of the ice well. So it wasn't a dream. The boys, however, understood the situation perfectly well. The words of the watcher barely reached Tlayne. You are a great father, Tlayne. You raised them well. Of course, they are still in shock, but I think they will be completely on your side. Just give them some time. No one can be held responsible for the rider's actions. They are perfectly aware of that. Who? Tlayne couldn't continue, but the watcher understood. 2 customers of the cafe and a waitress. The customers are already under investigation. But the waitress... Poor girl. She didn't recognize the situation and tried to interfere with Ryder's business. I killed them. Right there in the cafe. The watcher took a deep breath. One more time. Not you, Tlayne. The Mind Rider killed them. You were nothing more than a tool. And you know as well as I do that riders never do anything without a good reason. I'm sure there's something dark going on behind those 2. As for the waitress, Tlayne, anyone knows not to interfere when someone is being carried by a Mind Rider. The watcher's words reached Tlayne as if through a thick layer of absorbent cotton. Why had the rider chosen him to do such a horrible thing? Tlayne knew many people the Mind Riders used regularly, sometimes for days, to sway an election or get a law through the Grand Council. And now, such a fate had fallen to Tlayne for the first time in his life, to become the executioner. Some part of his consciousness, snapping out of the abyss of despair, noted that the watcher had suddenly lost interest in his ward and walked over to the window. Judging by the expression on the official's face, something unusual was clearly happening there. Something that overshadowed even the recent incident with Tlayne. But what could be more unexpected than the sudden execution performed by Mind Rider in public? Tlayne stood up and looked out the narrow window. All the people in the square stood motionless, heads raised. Many pointed to the sky, while more came out of the buildings surrounding the square to ask what was going on. Tlayne also looked up, just as a large, dark silhouette obscured the sun. In almost complete silence, emitting only a faint humming sound, some huge artificial machine slowly descended from the sky into the square. Tlayne knew for a fact that this thing could not have been built in the city. No exhaust pipe was visible, no wheels, and no light gas tank like the Northern Farms cargo airships had. He couldn't even imagine how this machine could stay in the air. And yet here it was, right in front of Tlayne's eyes. An oblong metal hull slowly descended into the plaza, but it was pretty clear that the machine had been built by humans, as a distinct inscription could be seen on its side. The letters had a somewhat unusual shape, but could still be easily made out. Research Ship Ibis, Earth. Amazing culture. Montes literally danced in place with excitement. Oleg, do you realize how unique this case is? All the lost colonies found so far have either catastrophically degraded or slowly progressed. Some even almost reached the beginning of the space age. But here, it's like everything has been frozen for hundreds of years. Sociologists from all over the Federation would sell their souls to come here for field research. Such incredible material. Koltsov looked at his comrade with a smile. Montes is probably already thinking up a title for a future monograph. After all, one of his university degrees is in the sociology of primitive societies. Although you can't call the society here primitive. I think it has to do with their unusual religion, Koltsov said. Captain Falson watched them from the screen, sitting in the control room of the Ibis on the orbit. This rider cult is something quite out of the ordinary. I've gone through everything I've been able to find in the archives of the Long-Range Scout Service, up to the times before the dispersion. Nothing even remotely similar. Montes nodded, expressively waving his hands. Did you notice that they don't speak of it as a religion? For them, it is an absolute reality, an everyday fact. This is the purest, primitive, mystical thinking, like the animists of the Stone Age. And yet they have a somewhat developed economy, some technologies at the level of the 19th century Earth, advanced agriculture, but no expansion. Because you see, the Mind Riders decided it was the wrong decision. I have yet to fully understand how they regulate fertility and population. Those I've been able to talk to have been very evasive on the matter. Add the language, Koltsov said. This is the first of the lost colonies, whose inhabitants can be spoken to without a cyberlinguist. The vocabulary is a bit different, but mostly due to the new concepts that our people came up with. They somehow managed to maintain it for almost half a millennium. Exactly! I can't wait to get started on the research. I've already made it clear to the local council that I'm interested in everything. First and foremost, I want to talk to the city's people and, if possible, the countryside. Montes finally calmed down a bit and settled into the swivel chair. I'm dying to get to that temple of theirs, the control house as they call it, and talk to the priests. But I've decided not to insist just yet. By the way, don't you think they took our arrival very calmly? Stoically, I'd say. Koltsov nodded. They were surprised, of course, but not for long. Some people came, looked at the shuttle, talked to you, and then went about their business as if nothing had happened. He pointed to the view screen, which showed the area near the shuttle. Indeed, the locals seemed to show little interest in the huge, by their standards, ship that had descended from the sky. Some were walking around, others stood at small stores on the first floors of 2- or 3-story buildings and leisurely chose goods or haggled with equally indifferent sellers. Only occasionally, someone cast a glance at the shuttle. Still, there was no more curiosity or any other emotion, say, fear or awe, which were common on planets degraded to the Neolithic, in those glances, than if they had seen rare visitors from a distant village or nearby city. However, there were no other cities on the planet, and this fact was amazing and confusing in its own right. Yes, it is surprising, Montes admitted. Although, from the few questions I was able to ask, it's obvious that they retained a vague memory of their origins and understood that we came from the same place as their distant ancestors. Okay, let's say that removes the mystical fear and some of the curiosity, but not to that extent. After all, this isn't the first world to preserve a history of settlement, but the arrival of humans from the outside has always caused a noticeable commotion. Heck, even my son would be running to watch the new ship, even though he's already been to 3 planets outside of Earth. Interestingly, there are plenty of children here, Koltsov said. At first glance, there are more than enough of them for the population to increase, but it's still only one city and the area around it. I'll scan the entire planet thoroughly, said Falson, who had been silently listening to their conversation until now. See if we missed anything. Some primitive tribes or, say, ruins of old settlements. But so far, my impression is that this is exactly what it seems at first glance. One single inhabited area for the entire planet. That, of course, is the mystery we have to solve. I think we have a visitors, Montes said suddenly, pointing to the screen. Indeed, a group of 4 people were heading toward the shuttle from a large building at the far end of the plaza. They were dressed, like everyone else here, in discreet, practical clothing of muted colors. None of them wore anything resembling weapons. It suddenly occurred to Koltsov that they hadn't seen any armed men or anything that could be mistaken for weapons unless you counted the knives and axes in the butcher shop. Also, an unusual trait, but not to say such an unpleasant one. Sometimes, and even quite often, the descendants of former colonists turned out to be very aggressive. Well, let's show some respect, he said. Let's go outside and talk. I'll keep an eye on the negotiations, Falson said. Try not to block the view of your body cams, and be careful. The locals seem peaceful so far, and I'd hate to see us take a turn for the worse with any careless behavior. If the 4 men waiting at the shuttle's entrance ramp noticed the faint blue glow of the protective fields around Montes and Koltsov, they didn't show it. Instead, they raised their hands with palms up. The researchers already knew that this was a local gesture of greeting and responded in kind. The council must discuss the situation and decide how to proceed, said one of the locals, who introduced himself as Tlayne, the council's junior assessor. Koltsov noted that among the 4, there were none of the people who had come to see them earlier. That, too, was unexpected. More often than not, colonies with some sort of bureaucratic system of government, such as a local council, would appoint a permanent delegation to communicate. Until the council comes to a unified decision, we ask that you take no active action. Otherwise, the rider's reaction may be unpredictable and harsh. I'm sorry if I'm breaking any taboos, Montes said. But I'd like to know, can't you learn the will of your gods through their priests? He pointed toward the massive building that the locals had called the control house. Or do you have to perform some kind of ritual first? The 4 members of the delegation looked at each other. A look of bewilderment flashed across their faces. You're using those strange words again, another junior assessor, a woman named Venga, said. Koltsov gave the locals a small plus. Not all primitive communities allowed women in the governing bodies. Why do you call the Watchers of the Will priests? And what are those gods, ritual, and taboo? We are not familiar with these concepts. Koltsov noticed that Montes was confused. So far, there had been no misunderstandings with the locals, for they spoke a somewhat archaic but generally little changed interlingua, the universal language of almost all mankind. Surprisingly, the language had hardly changed in the face of long isolation. But now, communication was clearly at a standstill. These are rather rare terms. We use them on Earth to denote certain cultural peculiarities of different peoples. He came to rescue Montes. We're just curious about your relationship with these mind riders, how it affects your daily life, and the development of society. I hope this is not forbidden information. The locals looked at each other again. No, of course not, Venga said. At least until the riders decide otherwise. In any case, there's almost nothing to tell since there are no relations. The riders decide what they want. So they determine what they want from you? Montes tried to take the initiative. Venga shook her head. Not them from us. The riders determine what they need to do to make us prosper. As long as we do the right thing, they don't interfere. But if we do the wrong, they fix it themselves. Montes's eyes glistened. It had been long since Koltsov had seen him so excited about a new discovery. And then, they channel their will through the priests. I'm sorry, the Watchers of the Will? He asked. Is that why they're called that? Because they channel the rider's will to everyone? The faces of locals were once again full of bewilderment. The riders don't tell anyone anything, Zoin said at last. They just do it. He cast a quick glance at the control house. But I'll try to talk to the Watchers. We didn't want additional contact before the riders' reaction was clear, but I think talking to the Watchers will do you good. Until then, please don't talk to any of the townspeople. It could end badly. For everyone. Tomorrow, everything will be resolved, one way or another. Without waiting for a response from the slightly dazed researchers, he nodded. The whole group repeated the gesture with raised hands and walked at a steady, unhurried pace toward the council house. Koltsov watched them thoughtfully. Don't you have the feeling that we have just received an unequivocal threat? He asked Montes. Oh, come on, Montes said. It's the usual wary reaction of leaders of a closed community who suspect their power may be threatened. As long as they lived here in their little world, they could keep the population in line by intimidating them with their vague theology. A political technique known since the time of the pharaohs, a small, educated minority lording it over the rest. They're not ignorant, Koltsov pointed out. They know electricity, use steam engines, and even zeppelins. This level of technology doesn't mix well with religious obscurantism. Yes, it's strange, Montes admitted. But you see what's happening. They have forbidden even the very concepts of religion and God, and at the same time, they can't even sneeze without the permission of the priestly top. Well, we're in no hurry, Koltsov said. Let's wait for them to sort it out in their council. Maybe we can talk to the Watchers of the Will soon. If they're going to stall the process, we can just fly out to some distant farm and talk to the people there face to face, Montes said. We haven't seen anything like telegraph wires or radio antennas. The local authorities won't have time to scare the entire population. Well, the lack of communications is understandable, Koltsov said. Why do they need it where the whole population lives practically in one town, except for a couple of villages? The concept of long-distance communication cannot arise where there is no one to contact. As for intimidation, you are wrong. In my opinion, no one here looks intimidated, rather indifferent. Look at this. He gestured around the square where the life of the small town was going on. They don't pay any attention to us at all. It's as if spaceships with people from other worlds come here every other day. You can't get that kind of reaction with intimidation. Sure thing, Montes replied absent-mindedly. Koltsov saw that his thoughts were somewhere very far away. All right, let's play by the council's rules. What's the use of hanging around outside? We can't talk to anyone but can monitor the locals on the screen. And without another word, he entered the shuttle. Koltsov stood for a while, looking at the paradoxically calm town around him. It looked like the staged decorations from the educational film Life of a Provincial European City of the late 19th century, only in a somewhat idealized version. The streets were clean, there were no beggars, not even poorly dressed, unkempt people, but there was no ostentatious wealth too, neither in people nor in buildings. But he had the unpleasant feeling that something was lurking behind this utopian order, perhaps even something dark and frightening. At the far end of the square, two men in leather aprons brought several buckets of water, poured them onto a stretch of sidewalk, and, kneeling down, began vigorously rubbing the cobblestones with stiff brushes. Koltsov wanted to go over and see what kind of dirt they found in this amazingly clean city, which had no horses or other draft animals. But he decided not to contradict the representatives of local authorities and went into the shuttle, closing the gangway behind him. Back at the control room, he pointed the camera in the right place. The men in aprons had already finished their work and left, leaving nothing to see behind, just a washed-up stain on the cobblestone sidewalk. Okay. Tomorrow, after the new negotiations, perhaps something would become clearer, including this incomprehensible religion, which the locals themselves don't seem to consider a religion. I can't leave for the plantations now. The watcher looked at Tlayne in silence. To an inexperienced person, he might have appeared to be dozing, leaning on his arms, but by the sharp squint of his eyes, Tlayne realized that the watcher was thinking intensely. Don't you understand? I'm a historian. This is the chance of a lifetime. I simply won't forgive myself if the meeting with progenitors goes on without me. Tlayne suddenly realized that this sounded very selfish and tried to approach it from a different angle. Besides, I can probably understand the progenitors' ways of thinking better than anyone else. After all, that's my specialty. There are other historians in the city, Watcher said. Tlayne waved his hand dismissively. Who? Soin? He had long ago abandoned the science. Political intrigue in the council interested him way more. The rest of them are just compilers. None of them will contribute anything new to history. The city needs me. The watcher was silent again for a moment, scrutinizing Tlayne. It's amazing how quickly you forgot about your session with the Mind Rider, he said. You are so excited now. For a moment I thought you were having a new session. Tlayne, who was about to start another tirade, collapsed and deflated instantly, as if all the air had been sucked out of him. The horrible image of himself standing in a pool of blood running down his sagging arms came back as a nightmarish, ghostly vision, obscuring the gray room with the watcher sitting at the table, and Selna's eyes, white with horror and understanding of what had happened. But I think you're being reasonable, the watcher continued. Of course, I cannot make such decisions alone, but I will pass your thoughts on to my superiors in the council. Moreover, I am even ready to support them on my own behalf. I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow you were part of the negotiating team with the progenitors. Tlayne looked at the watcher in confusion. But what about... I haven't finished my quarantine. The watcher stood up and smiled. In your case, I can take over and finish your quarantine early. Apparently, the rider who took advantage of you is no longer linked to your mind, and I'm inclined to agree that you can be useful to the city in negotiating with the progenitors. You will spend the night here in the control house, and by tomorrow morning, I believe everything will be settled. Good day to you. The watcher quickly threw up his hands in a parting gesture and left the room. Tlayne felt his poor head was about to explode with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Horror at what the rider had done by his hands, relief that his family had not been hurt, delight at the incredible event of the appearance of the progenitors, despair that he might not have time to meet them, hope that he would, even dislike for the former scientists who had turned into officials who could ruin everything. Finally, hypotheses and plans on how to communicate with the progenitors. It was all too much for one humble historian and teacher. To distract himself at least a little from this inner emotional storm, Tlayne stood up and walked to the window. The progenitor ship stood where it had landed this afternoon, in the very center of the town square. It seemed huge, incredibly complex, and majestic, yet Tlayne knew it was only a small landing vehicle, and the actual ship was somewhere far above, in orbit around the world. Most of the city's original archives had long since been lost, but from the scraps of information he had managed to find, Tlayne knew that interstellar ships were incapable of landing on planets. He tried to imagine it, but he couldn't. Just as he couldn't imagine the densely populated worlds of the progenitors, with hundreds or thousands of cities, many times the size of his hometown. From what he could find about the past, that was how life worked in the distant stars. Now that the progenitors had returned, he would have a chance to learn all about them, or at least what they would see fit to tell him about themselves. But it was still incredible, thousands of times more than he could imagine. Their arrival was an event of great importance that would change everything, literally, turn the life of the city upside down. The scalding cold thought suddenly splashed Tlayne with ice water. The Mind Riders. How would they take the arrival of the progenitors? Invisible and intangible, the Mind Riders stood guard over the fragile community of the city. Thanks to their care, the city could survive on an alien planet and exist here for so many centuries, cut off from the great civilization of the progenitors. Its inhabitants did not turn into filthy savages and did not die of hunger and disease. The riders ruled it, not communicating directly with the inhabitants, but rigidly and steadily pursuing a harsh but necessary policy, occupying at the right moments the minds of specific city inhabitants and doing what needed to be done by their hands. Of course, it was not always a matter of physically eliminating those who threatened the life of the city. For example, legend had it that one of the first rulers of the city, in the time before the council was created, had been under the control of the rider for 15 years, building up a system of governance. When the great session was over, he had gone mad, finding that he could not remember nearly a third of his life. Of course, it was only a legend, but now Tlayne, himself a recent survivor of the session, was willing to believe any legend about the power of the Mind Riders. But the main point was that the city had survived and prospered primarily because the riders had consistently destroyed any surprises that might have threatened it. And now, the arrival of the progenitors, an event the city had not known since its founding, a factor that could disrupt the stability created by centuries of careful regulation. Suddenly, Tlayne realized what he must do. Otherwise, something terrible could happen. "There's no way I expected this," Monte said. "If it's true, it changes everything. Although, to be honest, it's very, very hard to believe. Mental parasites are the stuff of cheap, silly magazines. But something tells me the locals are hardly familiar with pulp comic books. And yet, I see no reason for him to lie about all of this." Koltsov shook his head. "It doesn't look like he's lying. The guy looks genuinely scared and excited beyond belief, and that story he told about himself, how this hypothetical rider made him kill 3 people who were somehow threatening the stable life of the city. It was on the same spot where the local janitors were cleaning up today. Washing up blood, I guess. Why make up something like that about yourself? If it's a cult, it's incredibly sophisticated, Montes said. From what we know, now they have a normal, rational mind, regardless of what I initially thought. They don't believe that little demons cause disease. They use steam engines and electricity to some extent. They print books and newspapers. And they have normal physics, chemistry, astronomy, and anatomy at about the level of the late 19th century. Heck, with this level of development, they should have already populated the entire planet and built cities on other continents. And they still live in one town because the riders think it's more stable. And he agreed to a full examination, Koltsov remarked. He's never seen sophisticated medical equipment in his life, but he has no fear of it, only curiosity mixed with excitement. Just like you, the normal reaction of a scientist. They both looked at the screen. The local historian's eyes were closed, and his body relaxed. Koltsov thought that not every person back on Earth would be so calm about the procedure of a full scan. But here was a man from the age of steam engines, a small civilization of perfect stoics. But of course, the realization that at any moment you can turn from an intelligent being into a tool of the mysterious mind rider, fulfilling all his whims, certainly contributes to the development of such stoicism. That is, if the mind riders exist. So far, Tlayne's body and brain scans have revealed no deviations from typical human anatomy and physiology. No mutations, no traces of exotic diseases or parasite interference. An ordinary man with slightly elevated blood pressure and cholesterol levels, just like a desk scientist should have. But there had to be something. After all, Tlayne's story paradoxically fits the big picture very well. A small colony stuck for centuries in a strange social stasis was impossible without some powerful stabilizing factor. Tlayne claimed it was the mind riders, but could not explain what they were, except that they were real and had nothing to do with religion. In fact, the locals had no religion at all. The control house was not a temple, but some sort of hospital for those who had recently experienced a session with the rider. Watchers of the will were not priests, but people specially trained to determine whether a person was still under the rider's influence or in control of their actions, and whether their recent actions were the result of a session and not their own will. However, Tlayne claimed that such attempts to use the riders as an excuse were rare, as it could be perceived as destabilizing, and the riders don't like that. "Tlayne, are you all right? How do you feel?" Montes asked into the microphone. The man in the scanner opened his eyes. "Thank you, I'm fine. Are you done yet? I have to be back at the control house by 6 in the morning. I don't think they'll miss me until then, but I need to be present when the breakfast will be served." That's another oddity. What kind of control house is this, if anyone can leave unnoticed at any time? Apparently, the self-discipline of the locals has reached unbelievable heights. "Our apologies for the delay, Tlayne. Just a little more, okay? We want to do a full mentagram." Tlayne's eyes widened. "You want to read my mind?" Montes shook his head with a smile, but immediately realized that Tlayne couldn't see him. "No, of course not. It's impossible. The mentagram gives, how shall I put it, a picture of your brain activity and how your mind functions. But we can't read your thoughts. At best, we can tell from the mentagram that a person is excited, happy, or tense when solving logical problems. But its main value is comparative. There are standardized samples, and by comparing them, you can find abnormalities in a particular mentagram. So you want to know if I'm crazy? Koltsov shook his head admiringly. This local historian was a remarkably bright fellow. "Well, you're exaggerating and simplifying," Montes said. "But the mentagram can also be used to diagnose mental illness, that's true. We're wondering if there are any fundamental differences between city dwellers and us, people from Earth. Something that could be caused by prolonged contact with the mind riders." "All right," Tlayne replied calmly. "But I've already told you that 90% of the population never experiences a rider session. And even for the remaining 10, the sessions are often so quick and easy that they don't require a special recovery regimen. I was just unlucky." The mental scanning had already begun, and both researchers noted the sudden emotional surge caused by Tlayne's words about the rider session. Whatever it was, it had left a deep mark on his soul. "It's okay, Tlayne," Montes said. "It's all right. Just try to relax." "You sound just like a watcher of the will," Tlayne remarked. "But you're right. I have to help you figure things out so that nothing bad happens. I'll do my best." He can do it, Koltsov thought. Tlayne was seeing a spaceship for the first time in his life, for the first time in generations on this planet. He was lying in a most complex device, far beyond his comprehension. And yet here it was. The mentagram clearly showed that he already started to relax. Such perfect self-control was only to be envied. "Nothing," Montes said, looking at the mentascope screen. "Nothing at all. A normal person, just like you and me. And you know what? That's the problem." "What do you mean?" Koltsov turned to his colleague. Montes pointed to a Tlayne's gradually detailing three-dimensional mentogram. If the mind riders were some kind of product of mass psychosis of the locals, causing them to commit various acts from time to time, especially such horrible ones as the one Tlayne confessed to, it would certainly be reflected in the mentagram. Incidentally, increased religiosity would also be very noticeable, even if they don't call it that themselves. I won't say I'm such an experienced mentoscopist, but even I can see that there's nothing like that. The first thing that comes to mind is that he's just a masterful liar. Montes shook his head. It's ironic, but the lie, or rather the mental activity behind it, as you must remember your side of the story, would also be visible on the mentascope, even if he didn't say anything. Needless to say, despite all the implausibility, everything Tlayne has told us fits into a fairly logical picture. There is one decisively incomprehensible link, Koltsov said. Who or what are these mind riders? Montes looked thoughtfully at Tlayne, lying calmly in the belly of the scanner. We'll have to pore through the main Ibis database. Try to compare and correlate all even remotely similar cases, even the unconfirmed ones. Falson will finish scanning the planet and put the ship in geostationary orbit over the city sometime in the morning, Koltsov said. Until then, we'll have to wait. And Tlayne has to go. He's already done so much for us, more than we could ask. He doesn't see it that way, Montes said. From his point of view, he's trying to keep things stable. And you know, given the methods he says these riders use to maintain stability, I don't mind. He yawned and looked at his watch. We still have a few hours left, and I intend to make the most of them. Let's let our friend go. I need some sleep. Go ahead, Koltsov told him. I'll finish it myself. That way, at least one person will get some proper sleep. I'll finish with the Tlayne, and we'll start work in the morning with a fresh head. Long before morning, however, events began to unfold in a very different direction. In the middle of the night, Koltsov woke up to someone shaking him insistently by the shoulder. When he opened his eyes, he saw Montes's worried face. Did you let that native out? Montes asked worriedly as soon as he saw that Koltsov is awake. Of course, Koltsov said, sitting up in bed. Tlayne went straight to Control House. There wasn't a living soul in the square, by the way. Why? Did you close the ramp? Of course I did. What do you take me for? Koltsov was getting worried too. Wait, where are you going with this? Montes nervously looked over his shoulder. I think there's someone on the shuttle. Koltsov scrutinized Montes's face. Are you having a nightmare? There's not even enough places to hide here. I'm telling you! Montes leaned toward Koltsov and whispered frantically in his ear. I've looked all over, but it won't go away. I don't know how it eludes me, but I know for sure someone is watching me. They've somehow infiltrated the shuttle and are hiding, waiting for the right moment. Koltsov turned on the lamp at the headboard and looked intently into Montes's eyes. No, the pupils were not dilated, but something was clearly happening to the scientist. All right, Koltsov said, standing up and reaching for his clothes. Let's go see what's bothering you. Just as he expected, they found nothing. I swear to you, there was someone there, Montes said, and I still feel that he's not completely gone. Very well, Koltsov replied. I believe you. You felt something. But we just checked everything. Montes, it's just a shuttle. 2 cabins, a control room, a sick bay, and a couple of cargo bays. That's it. There's nowhere to hide. You know, I think it's just fatigue. He looked at Montes, who by now looked quite miserable. Don't worry, it's nothing. Take some sleeping pills, and I'll wake you up in the morning. What happened next was so unexpected that Koltsov was stunned and confused for the first few moments. Montes jumped back and grinned viciously. You want to finish us off? He hissed through clenched teeth. You're with them. You want to bury me on this lousy planet, and Tlayne and Ibis, you all work together. The situation was so delusional that Koltsov didn't know what to think. What had bitten Montes? He had never shown any signs of mental instability. Unstable people weren't even accepted into the research corps. It was a strict screening process. And even though it looked as if Montes had been stressed out and lost his mind, Koltsov refused to believe it. But what else could it be? His feverish thoughts were interrupted by the Montes himself. Koltsov had been saved by regular workouts with Tlayne at the gym. While Montes preferred the exercise bike and swimming pool to keep in shape, Tlayne taught Koltsov hand-to-hand combat, which he had practiced since childhood. Before even realizing what was happening, Koltsov dodged a swinging blow to the head. The inertia of the swing carried Montes further. Koltsov hit Montes a couple of times on the back of the head and barely had time to pick up the collapsed body. After dragging Montes to the sick bay, he secured him to the bunk, locking the power bracelets on his arms and legs. Adrenaline was still pulsing in his temples, fighting confusion and numbness. What the hell had happened? The strained thoughts even made Koltsov's eyes darken, and it became a little harder to breathe. Damn Montes, he would ruin the whole expedition and nullify their amazing discovery. Maybe it would be better to get rid of him? Koltsov came to his senses when his hand reached inside the drawer containing scalpels, lancets, and other surgical instruments. What was he doing? And then he was pierced by a thought which should have occurred to him from the beginning. An outside influence. If they behaved strangely after landing on an alien planet, the cause was most likely due to some outside factor. Sure, they didn't eat local food or drink local water, but they both breathed the local air. They ran every test possible, and the locals, who are of the same species of Homo sapiens, felt fine. But something could always slip through. What if molecules of an unknown local hallucinogen were present in the air? That would explain everything, including the strange pseudo-religion of the locals. Koltsov rushed to the control room but immediately stopped. Filtering all the air in the shuttle would take too long. A quicker solution was needed. A couple minutes later, he was already pulling on his spacesuit. His head was spinning. The logical, normal thoughts mixed with strange bursts of emotion and desire, like that instant urge to kill Montes. Staggering, Koltsov reached the control room to turn on the air purification system. They hadn't turned off the view screens when they left. He initially ignored them, but when he finally made the necessary manipulations on the life support console, he looked up. The recently completely deserted square was now filled with people. Silent, motionless figures stood silently watching the shuttle, like the petrified army of an ancient emperor. Through the circles in front of his eyes, Koltsov could distinguish among them the dark-clad watchers of the will and the ordinary townspeople. Men, women, young, old. There wasn't time to accurately assess the local population, but it seemed to Koltsov that if not the entire city was here, then at least most of it. The spacesuit was providing him with the cleanest air now, but he was feeling worse and worse. Nearly losing consciousness and desperately fighting the urge to accelerate the shuttle and crash it in the ocean, he engaged the gravity thrusters, ripped the seal off the emergency autopilot switch that would return the shuttle to Ibis, and collapsed to the floor. Even after a hefty dose of painkillers, the headache didn't cease. In addition, Koltsov was plagued by a persistent dry mouth, which he constantly replenished with a light tonic, also to no avail. "Be patient," Falson told him. "It's just a backdraft of the adrenaline rush. The body will gradually recover. Just give it time." "What about the hallucinogen?" Falson shook his head. "There was no hallucinogen. I ran the air from the shuttle and your and Montez's blood through every possible test. It's clean as a whistle." "But we were poisoned by something." "No, you weren't." Koltsov stared at him, perplexed. "What do you mean, no? Then what happened to us?" Instead of answering, Falson pressed a few keys. 2 images appeared on the large screen in the wardroom. "Do you recognize it?" Koltsov took a closer look. "Some kind of mentogram. I'm not an expert. It's more of a Montes thing. But it looks like a mentogram of this local Tlayne, the one who told us all sorts of stories. And this," he pointed to the second image, "is an exact replica of the first one. What does that mean?" Falson sighed. "The thing is, it's not a copy. The one on the left is indeed Tlayne's mentogram, but the one on the right is the mentogram I took off Montes just an hour ago." Koltsov froze with his mouth open. "Wait a minute," he said at last. "You're wrong on that. Even I know that there's no such thing as an identical mentogram. It's like DNA or fingerprints, even more reliable, especially if you increase the detail. Did you check?" "And double-checked." Falson nodded. "I couldn't believe my eyes either, so I ran it through the processor. It's 100% match, not even a margin of error." Koltsov suddenly remembered the wild look in Montez's eyes. "So it's true," he said slowly. Tlayne was not lying, nor was he recounting local fanciful beliefs. Riders exist, and one of them is riding Montes now? Falson smiled, though there was no joy in that smile. "No, there's no such thing as benevolent mind riders looking out for the good of the colony. Of course not, though that didn't make poor Montes feel any better." "Then what?" Falson pressed another button. The image on the screen changed. Another mentogram. "This is yours," Falson explained. "Doesn't it remind you of anything?" Koltsov stared at the screen, not wanting a terrible guess to creep into his brain. Realizing his condition, Falson returned one of the previous mentograms to the screen next to Koltsov's. Yet, the mentograms were different. Similar, but different. "So I'm not infected?" Koltsov asked. "Or not fully infected?" Falson smiled again, more good-naturedly. You have picked quite a term, but you are almost right. You have managed to retain your individuality. Perhaps the super-personality did not immediately start your correction, and you managed to escape its influence. Koltsov stared at him. Super-personality? Well, it's a term I had to invent for what we thought were the inhabitants of the former colony. Of course, it's still just a hypothesis, but I think I've got it. Falson looked at the mentograms. I believe that you and Montes indeed experienced a mental attack, but not by the mythical riders. It was the collective mind of all the people on the planet. Think about it, he continued, nodding toward the stunned Koltsov. We were struck by the fact that the colony seemed to be frozen in its development, even though its technological level should suggest an energetic progress and expansion. It was like it was being held together by some incredibly powerful stabilizing factor. Assuming it's a collective mind focused solely on self-preservation, a kind of psychic immunity, it all fits. But we talked to Tlayne. He acted and spoke like a completely independent human being, and he was genuinely convinced that our arrival would not please the Mind Riders because we were disrupting the stability of the... Koltsov suddenly cut himself short. Oh shit. Exactly. Falson nodded. Probably, some autonomy of the components of this super-personality is also essential to maintain the status quo. And they do not realize that they are parts of something bigger, just as, for example, individual cells of our brain do not realize it. Perhaps the super-personality also does not have self-consciousness, turning on only when something threatens its existence. Hence all these strange and sometimes terrible deeds, supposedly committed under the influence of the riders. Although, in fact, the parts of the super-personality themselves make these decisions based on a common consensus, a sort of subconscious adhocracy, so to speak. I'm willing to bet that if you took mentograms from all the planet's inhabitants, they would perfectly match. And each of them bears the full super-personality imprint. However, each living unit uses only part of that personality to create its own individuality. What about Montes? And me? Falson sighed. I think the super-personality assessed both of you first, tried to figure out what you were, and then it tried to rewrite you. It must have mistaken you for some malfunctioning units. Unfortunately, it seems to have succeeded in the case of poor Montes. Do you think he won't make it? I don't know. You started to come to your senses pretty quickly. I don't think the mental field of a super-personality, or whatever it is, extends very far. Actually, it can be estimated quite accurately by how far its parts live away from each other. It doesn't reach orbit, of course. But I've taken a mentogram from Montes several times. No change. Koltsov looked at Falson in horror. So he's not him anymore? This super-personality had inscribed itself into his consciousness, erasing everything? Killed Montes? Not exactly. Remember, every part of it on the planet has a certain amount of personality, and Montes retained it when he attacked you. Already reprogrammed. We can only hope that after losing the connection with super-personality, Montes will fully recover. Time will tell. Falson sighed again. In the meantime, we'll have to put the planet under strict quarantine until we figure out how the super-personality parts communicate. But how is that even possible? How can ordinary people turn into this? That, too, remains to be discovered. I found something in the archives. It wasn't just a colony. It was a research base. They were studying local biology and, for some reason, physics, quantum effects and all that. Maybe it had something to do with it, but that is for the experts to figure out. Koltsov felt his eyes begin to close despite the overabundance of news and excitement. He needed to rest, so he went to his quarters, leaving Falson alone in front of the screen. As he fell asleep, he didn't notice that the locks on the doors to his quarters had shifted and were blocked from the central control panel. Falson didn't want to take any unnecessary risks. Tlayne stared at the Watcher of the Will. But I remember everything perfectly, even the inscription on the side. Research Ship Ibis, Earth. It was right there, under the windows, right in the center of the square. The Watcher smiled. Tlayne, we don't know why Ryder wanted to do this, but there can be no doubt that he had his own reasons for showing you this story. Perhaps it's a test of sorts. Many Watchers agree that the Riders have some special plans for you, Tlayne. In a way, I even envy you. The Watcher nodded toward the door. But don't you want to go back to your family? Tlayne was completely confused. What about resettlement? Restoration after the killings? After the execution? You know, the one I did during the session? What execution? The Watcher looked Tlayne straight in the eye. Tlayne, during the session, you stood motionless in the square for 2 days, staring at one point, and then you came to the council and started telling your fantastic story about the visit of the Progenitors, and then you fell asleep right there. Are you saying now that the Mind Rider showed you something else you haven't told me yet? Tlayne opened his mouth, but closed it. No, he said. I think it was just a nightmare. It was the first session of my life, and it's been so long. I must have gotten overexcited. It happens. The Watcher nodded. Don't worry. It'll all be forgotten soon. And your story. We still have to work hard to understand what it means and what the Riders wanted to tell us. But that's our problem. Go. Your family is waiting for you. Tlayne said goodbye and left the Watcher's office. Walking down the stairs to the control house's exit, he fumbled in his pocket for a small device with a small screen and a few buttons he had stolen from the Progenitor's ship. One of them, Montes, said it could be used to transmit information over long distances. He should study it properly and experiment with it, but he must be careful that no one finds out about it. Stability is paramount.